Now we continue with a coverage on KZN's worsening extortion and construction cases. My colleague Xoli Mngambi is standing by with analyst Imraan Buccus on whether there is a link between these suspected extortionists and politicians. Xoli, a very crucial theme to explore when it comes to the construction mafia.
Indeed, Masai, very good evening to you once again. So this research done by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, they make their findings that there is a clear link that exists between the so-called construction mafia and some political leaders. And so the accusation comes about as to whether these so-called extortionists are acting at times on instructions of certain politicians. And then you add to that mix the taxi industry in KwaZulu-Natal. They are said to be the enforcers. And so when you have that combination, that toxic combination, you only have to ask the question, how is business, legitimate business now, supposed to protect themselves against such a powerful force? Let's discuss this now with Dr. Imraan Buccus. He is a political analyst based in KwaZulu-Natal. Doc, good evening to you and thank you for your time. Let's deal first with that direct link that is made by this research conducted by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, that there exists this link between the so-called construction mafia and certain political figures. Are police up to the task when it comes to that? Because at times you will think that they actually are going to be reticent.
Well, I think broadly the point is that the interweaving of crime and politics in any society is really dangerous. And what we're seeing in South Africa, and perhaps particularly in KZN, is the politicization of gangsterism and the gangsterization of our politics. And I think that's really clear. So the other point to make is this is not uniquely South African. This has happened in many societies around the world, and not necessarily just post-colonial societies. Often, when societies transition, there's a very fine line between the state and the underworld. Now, this has occurred historically even in countries like the US, highly developed societies. Chicago in the 30s, fine line between the state and the underworld. Nothing much happened in local government without the underworld. Of course, we know the examples of Colombia, Mexico, and that's the same thing that's happening here. Because the state is seen as a facilitator of social mobility, and the state, and now including the private sector, are seen as mechanisms of self-enrichment, right? And again, I'll make the point not completely surprising, because when you have a government like we have in South Africa, one of its functions is to consolidate a black middle class. You had almost a non-existent black middle class prior to 94, about, I think, 300,000. Today, the black middle class is between 5 and 6 million. And it's officially overtaken the white middle class. So that's a very important imperative, and it should be unapologetic. But the problem is when you loot the public purse in the way that it's being done, and when you gangsterize politics in the way it's being done. So when we talk about the construction mafia in KZN, we know that historically there are clear links to particular political parties. And those lines have been blurred. So I think we're in a really worrying situation. KZN has been a province that has been through, these kinds of ruptures in the past, in the early 90s. Of course, much, much worse. But we are seeing a return, with the extortion rackets, with the gangsterization of politics, to really worrying violence that's happening in a province like this.
Is it surprising, therefore, Dr. Buccus, that with the historical background that you paint of this province, that you find in this toxic mix the taxi industry. I don't think it's ever really an easy exercise to try and divorce them from the politics of the day, because some of them have direct links to certain politicians. You have to then think of the police force or the police service in trying to tackle this. Do you think that they are up to the challenge, and does it answer perhaps the question as to why we are seeing them seemingly fighting fire with fire? This has become a very violent province in terms of dealing with criminality.
Yeah, I think some people have welcomed the police action. Others have called into question the way the police are going about it. But I think ultimately people wanted to see action occurring. So if we draw back to the 90s, we also had a really violent province. Of course, for other reasons, for political reasons. And the police were said not to have had the competence to deal with it in KZN. And what happened at that stage is police units, interventionist units were brought in from other parts of the country. Now, I think when there are allegations that there might be intersections between the police and the construction mafia, or, you know, through to other mechanisms and outfits that are acting like this, I think it's really important that forces are brought in from outside of the province in order to deal with it. And I think, you know, it's a point I've made before. I think that's something that we need to think really clearly about. We have the advantage of having a police minister like Senzo Mchunu, who's been in KZN, he knows the dynamic, he's been premier here. So I think the machinations of politics, the intersections of politics and gangsterism, if you like, or the underworld, is something he's quite accustomed to.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that someone like him will see benefit in bringing a force from outside of the province to help deal with this.
Talking about someone who has links to KZN, this morning on this channel we spoke to the Deputy Minister of Public Works, Sihle Zikalala. This is someone with deep roots to KZN. He's born here. At the time that he took over the premiership, this extortion around construction projects was probably at its highest. And he has tried to deal with it even after he left this province to become a minister. I want us to take a listen for a moment to the words he said this morning about possibly the police making headway, even trying to take us to the masterminds. And we'll continue the conversation in a moment.
The investigations by the police will lead us to know who are the masterminds behind these activities. Because when it started, it came from KwaZulu-Natal, it mushroomed to become a phenomenon that affects the whole country. And that's why it will be important that those who are arrested are squeezed and investigated to ensure that they also are releasing who are the mastermind and who work with them in this activity.
Sihle Zikalala there, the Deputy Minister of Public Works, saying the police are going to lead us to the masterminds. Is that something that we ought to take to heart, or perhaps wishful thinking?
Well, you know, Sihle Zikalala is a really well-known politician in KZN. I think he's a seasoned politician, he's a talented politician, and he's been able to maneuver a really complex set of situation that he's faced in KZN, with the whole Zuma dynamic, with a range of other dynamics. I do think that, there's merit in what he's saying, although I think there's a far greater complexity to how this should be dealt with. For one, I think the way the police are dealing with it, allegations of extrajudicial killings, allegations of, not properly using intelligence, not, having all at hand before acting, that there might even be people who are innocent who become victims of police action. And I think it might be a little simplistic to suggest that the police will lead us to, those who are at the wrong end of the law. I do think you need outside intervention. I do think we need to be also constantly aware that there are political parties that have an uneasy relationship with the Constitution and with the rule of law. Parties that make the point that the Constitution is an impediment to delivery, for example. In the same way, I think the police and those who are important state stakeholders ensure that we kind of approach this within the parameters of the law, within the parameters of the Constitution. And I'm not entirely sure how the police will just be able to lead us through this to people that they have, in their custody already. I think there's a further complex set of factors that need to be visited. Yeah.
Dr. Buccus, we were going to take a break, but here's a question I'd like for you to ponder whilst we are on a break. Is this extortion or forced transformation because of a clear lack of economic justice for those who live in impoverished communities? Because there is this 30% that is constantly spoken about. Sihle Zigarala again repeats that when it comes to multinational companies that get contracts from our government, that they've got to bring in this 30% element from the local space where they will be working in order to empower that community. So are these people going about it the wrong way, being forceful about it? But we'll answer that question when we return. You're watching a special broadcast of the extortion racket, and this is countrywide, but its genesis is the KwaZulu-Natal province, and this is based on research that we have been referencing since we started this broadcast, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, bringing up some very, very interesting statistics, information about when this started and where we are as a country and whether or not we are going to survive it if the police are going to be capacitated to deal with it effectively. Dr. Buccus, we're on the question of the socio-economic conditions of the country. Is this extortion, or, as the business groupings that call themselves that, in the media, of course, we call them construction mafia because of the extortionist behavior, but is this forced transformation because these communities are saying, there's nothing coming to us, so if we don't stand up for ourselves, no one else will?
Of course, there's merit in what they're saying, right? So what we had in '94 was political democratization. But like the EFF and others constantly remind us, we haven't had economic transformation. We remain, of course, we've had, we have a huge middle class bulge, we have a middle class explosion. Class is less racialized than it was maybe even 10 years ago. And the fact that you now have 5 to 6 million people in the black middle class is a really significant number. At the same time, it's insignificant. It's insignificant because proportionally, in a country with the demographics that we have, 5 to 6 million is small. But significant, of course, in that it's overtaken the white middle class. And we live in the most unequal society in the world. There's a constant juxtaposition of extreme poverty and extreme wealth. We're sitting in Umhlanga, its development indicators are similar to Beverly Hills. But if you crane your neck and look across the hill, you see Amaoti Township, right?
Yeah.
Where people are living in dire poverty. The same for Sandton and Alex, the same in Cape Town. So of course there's the need for transformation. And to revisit the point we made earlier, is when you have a liberation movement in power, it's imperative that that liberation movement facilitates an expansion of the middle class, right? The problem is you don't do it in the way the construction mafia is doing it, right? Because the way in which it's being done currently is, of course, illegal, one might argue, but it's also empowering a small elite, right? There can be questions asked about to what extent is this, for want of a better expression, broad economic empowerment, or is this, simply consolidating an elite? And, if one thinks back about African political philosophers or political philosophers acting on the continent, people like Frantz Fanon have reminded us of this. You'll have an elite in power, and that elite will mimic the previous powers in that they would loot the public purse, not for the good of society, but for their personal good, right? The Lamborghinis and the Louis Vuittons. And that's what we're seeing now.
Yeah.
But of course, there's merit in the idea that you do need to empower, you do need to redistribute wealth, and you can't have the kind of anomaly that we have in South Africa. But of course, the way it's being done is problematic.
I remember at one point, President Ramaphosa being raked over the coals by the opposition in Parliament for suggesting at one point that it is the state that is going to create jobs. But then he had to quickly make an about turn and say government or the state facilitates for business to thrive. And so my next conversation is going to be with the business chamber. Has business done enough to lift poor communities out of poverty if they are going to be confronted in the manner in which they are at these construction sites, simply because people, at least those who are brave enough, are willing to even break the law to try and feed themselves?
No, absolutely. Well, coming back to what Ramaphosa said, I don't think he was wrong, right? But yes, of course, the qualification of the state facilitating is true. But this idea that opposition parties might have in South Africa, that the state needs to remove itself from development, I think is off the mark. In a country like ours, you do need state intervention. It's the idea of addressing poverty in order to get growth, not to get growth so that it trickles down and helps poor people. So, yes, of course, the state should act as a facilitator, but you do need state intervention. This idea that we should have less state intervention in a country like South Africa, I don't think is going to work, and it hasn't worked in many other developing societies.